Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C Stewart, and in a wide-ranging programme today, we're going to be talking a fairly wide range of topics, which will be both international and bringing you back home. So we're going to talk Ukraine, Brexit, cost of living crisis, and maybe a wee bit on a leadership election happening close to us just now. But before I launch into what we have planned for today, I am delighted to be joined very colourfully by our guest, Dr. Alan Flowers, who tells me, and you will, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're in the largest library of Belarusian literature outside of Belarus itself. And indeed, as an academic of 30 years standing in Britain, you have worked with both Belarus and Ukraine during that time and are still, though you are retired, I believe, Alan, the chair of the Belarusian Society. So welcome.
Yes, Anglo-Belarusian Society. I'm down from Edinburgh. I'm mainly living in Edinburgh now. And I'm down for Edinburgh for a very important weekend of Ukraine events. And this afternoon, today, I'm sitting in exactly what you said, outside Belarus. It's the Francis Scarina Library in North London, where after the war and many collections were made of Belarusian literature. There's a very specific focus on that little country that's become so much part of what's happened in the last year, the country of Belarus. So we'll maybe say some things later about that. I'm very happy to be with you today. And you'll see over my shoulder, of course, the Ukrainian flag, and there's the Free Belarus, white, red, white. That's the democratic, the not Mr. Lukashenko, the not dictatorship flag, the flag of Free Belarus that's helping and working with Ukrainians.
Thank you very much. And of course, as Alan touched on, Ukraine is very much in our thoughts. It is now day 368 of Putin's incursion into the democratic sovereign state of Ukraine. And news from today is that thousands of people have taken part in a demonstration in central Berlin to protest against giving more weapons to the Ukraine, urging the German government to instead pave the way for negotiations with Putin. In London, Marina Litvinenko, the widow of the defector poisoned in London by the Putin regime, allegedly, or proven, depending upon your point of view, led calls for a Ukrainian victory in the war at a demonstration of several hundred outside the Russian embassy. A meeting in India of finance chiefs of the group of 20 leading economies has ended without a consensus, with Russia and China objecting to the description of the war in Ukraine in a final document. In a statement at the end of the meeting in Bengaluru, the G20 chair, the host country India, said a statement demanding Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine was endorsed by all members, except, I suppose unsurprisingly, by Moscow and Beijing. And the French president has said that China's engagement in peace in Ukraine is a good thing. Emmanuel Macron told reporters he would visit China in early April, in part to seek Beijing's help with ending the war. He said China must help us put pressure on Russia so that it never uses chemical or nuclear weapons. The United States has intelligence that the Chinese government, however, is considering providing Russia with drones and ammunition for use in Ukraine, according to US officials. They said it did not appear Beijing had yet made a final decision. However, CNN reported that Russia-China negotiations about the price and scope of the equipment were ongoing. Poland's largest oil company, PKN Orlen, has stopped receiving oil via a pipeline from Russia, its CEO Daniel Obajtek has said. Orlen said it could fully supply its refineries via sea and that consumers would not be affected by the halt. Russian oil accounts for about 10% of the Polish supply. The head of Russia's Wagner mercenary private military army, Yevgeny Prigozhin, claimed on Saturday that his fighters had captured the eastern Ukraine village of Yahidny, north of Bakhmut, according to Reuters. After 6 months of heavy fighting, Ukrainian forces were reported to have blown up a bridge near Bakhmut this month in a possible sign of retreat. Ukraine has denied it intends to leave the city. Explosions have reportedly been heard in the Russian-occupied city of Mariupol in southern Ukraine, according to Petro Andriushenko, an advisor to the city's exiled mayor. The explosions were reported in the location of a large Russian military personnel cluster, he said, adding, "It's a good trend." Ukraine's armed forces have in recent days claimed strikes on Mariupol, previously thought to be outside the effective range of Ukrainian missiles. Mikhailo Podolyak, a senior advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky, has dismissed as unrealistic China's proposals to end the conflict. Podolyak posted on Twitter that Beijing should not bet on an aggressor who broke international law and will lose the war. President Zelensky has cautiously welcomed China's 12-point proposal to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but said it would be acceptable only if it led to Vladimir Putin pulling his troops out from all occupied Ukrainian territory. Russia appears to have run out of its current stock of Iranian-made drones and will seek to resupply, according to the UK Ministry of Defence's latest update. And the European Union has agreed to impose a 10th package of sanctions on Russia in response to its invasion, just in time for a self-imposed deadline to mark the first anniversary of the war. The latest round of sanctions tackled the banking sector, advanced technologies, and Russia's access to technology that could be used for civilian and military purposes, according to the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell. And US President Joe Biden has ruled out, for now, sending American advanced fighter jets to Ukraine, saying Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky doesn't need F-16s now. The US President told the ABC, American Broadcasting Company, there is no basis upon which there is a rationale, according to our military, right now, to provide F-16s to Ukraine. And the Belarus President, Alexander Lukashenko, said he and Vladimir Putin spoke for a long time on Friday. Lukashenko's remarks to reporters came as China's foreign ministry confirmed he is expected to visit China on Tuesday. And Alan, I suppose that with the widening out of elements of the conflict, with Turkey involved potentially in negotiations between two sides, now China has become involved. There have been strikes, I believe, from Belarus, and Lukashenko's own role within this has always been one which has been interesting to watch and terrifying to witness. And of course, there's also been the idea that Moldova may well be drawn into some kind of underground, underhand, heaven forfend, we suggest the Russians are guilty of it, internal conflict. So it does appear that this is something that the entire world should pay very close attention to.
Well, absolutely, but perhaps it might have been better if the world had been paying such close attention to events in 2014, when the arrival of what was termed the Little Green Men, the ununiformed, unbadged, unflagged individuals, clearly assisted and supported by Russia, arrived in Donetsk, Lugansk, and also Crimea, and took very substantial parts of Ukraine at that time. Now, all this question about negotiations, well, let's not forget we've seen this happening, and you've referenced the Mr. Lukashenko. By the way, this is the man who stole an election in 2020, and the British government uses the phrase lacks legitimacy. And in Britain, the British government never uses the word president, so we'll call that particular individual Mr. Lukashenko. I mean, he was running these Minsk negotiations. The new dimension is absolutely, definitely the China role, because uniquely, that might give Putin the kind of security guarantee, the sort of buffer, the issue about this threat of NATO and the West to Russia, because his causa belli is essentially there is a threat. He's got the Russian people really believing in this threat. So the problem is, one, one story has to be followed and countered really by another one. And in fact, I would have thought it's a very easy guarantee for China to do, because the Chinese are not so stupid, and they probably realize that they'll know there's absolutely no question of the West trying to mount an invasion on Russia. So this issue that Putin has to have his buffer states. Well, he's occupied Belarus very successfully, leaving Mr. Lukashenko to run the civil side and keep his security forces around him to keep in power. And of course, as we know, he takes the view that Ukraine absolutely should be in his preserve as well. But it is a little bit of an old style buffer state mentality that's there. So the 12 points, there's a lot in there from China. But we've seen negotiations before, and the real concern is that what Russia wants is what Russia has wanted for nearly 100 years. This history of trouble and incursions has gone on since Stalin's time, creating instability on the borders. In Georgia, they've had Russian presence in lands that would be considered Georgian, that's South Ossetia and Abkhazia, since 1992-3. There was a 2008 event and a further incursion in South Ossetia. That's not been pushed back. And the real concern with this is that the game, Moscow will play the same game they've played in these other areas. And this will just go on and on. So there's no surprise that the clear statement from Ukraine is, for a start, that there is going to be no peace until the 2014, which are the same, the 2014 borders of Ukraine, prior to arrival of Russian influence, were the same as the 1991-92 borders at the breakup of the Soviet Union. So that's the borders. That's the declared UN country, the internationally recognized country of Ukraine. Now, whether they have to be pushed out with all the forces, and of course these minor setbacks now, it's all about Ukraine just getting enough time. There's obviously new weapons going in. And it's quite clear Ukraine is preparing the fact that the only way to get the lands returned to Ukraine, currently occupied by Russian forces, is to push them forcibly out. Now, we all hope that tomorrow Mr. Putin will wake up and have a blinding flash of realization that he's wasting thousands and thousands of Russian lives and doing himself and his country no good, and decide, well, with an appropriate security guarantee, and I'm sure security guarantees could be given to the Russian lands as they were in 2014. And China may come in and do that. So it's going to be interesting weeks ahead of this parallel peace negotiations. And of course, anybody with sanity would rather see the Churchillian jaw rather than war and needless loss of lives. But unfortunately, track record of Mr. Putin and the track record of Moscow, those in government in Moscow for many, many decades, it's not good in this area. And there's plenty of precedent to look at.
Indeed, and I suppose that one of the things that did hit the headlines, I mean, we're used to Russian incursion in Chechnya. We're used to, I think, that when the Belarus elections and the fleeing of the democratic opposition out of the country grabbed headlines. The incursion in Georgia, very much a less covered by the media and indeed by the world in many ways. Whereas now, this full frontal assault upon the idea of democracy as much as the sovereign state of Ukraine, for some, the idea of there being a settled peace, a settlement in some way, some sort of negotiation, would appear for Zelensky to mean going back to the pre-2014 borders and Crimea coming back into Ukraine because it's sovereign territory. And it's difficult to contemplate how you would expect any country to accept the annexation of part of its borders. And you can't help the parallel with Anschluss, Sudetenland et al.
Yes, I mean, a huge amount of history there. The crazy thing about this is that there was an arrangement over Crimea since Khrushchev passed it under essentially Kiev management and control back in the early 50s. I think it was around about 54 there was that arrangement. So in terms of the history, it is true that the holding, the political control of Crimea has did change during the last centuries, which makes it a relatively recent Ukrainian control. However, there were agreed peaceful international borders in 1992, the declared recognized by Russia as well. And there is absolutely no doubt, and nobody's arguing in the West anyway, that these borders have been changed by anything other than force. But here the point is, and you've rightly referenced Georgia 2008. I was actually there. I arrived on the 16th of August. The incursion started on the 8th of August, summertime. Maybe a lot of people missed it because of that. And it was a very short period of incursion, and it was resolved by a pullback. But the Russians, Putin still won out of that. He ended up controlling more territory than at the start, and that was a complete failure. Basically, the deal should have been get the Russian troops out of all of South Ossetia, or come to some compromise, some arrangement over what Tbilisi is managing in that area and what Moscow is managing. So there is a real danger, and the precedent is not good about the international community just wanting to walk away from a problem by having countries lose some of their territory. Now, the Ukrainians are clearly made of sterner stuff. There are huge new amounts of weapons that are now not fully defensive. I mean, when we started off, as we know, Britain gave huge assistance to ensuring that any incursion of armour would be met with a very bloody and forceful response. And that worked. What was sent actually achieved the aim, as we know, because the taking of Kiev failed and the Russian forces were cleared out of all northern Ukraine. Now, that was a very successful first move. The same material and approach hasn't been able to work for various reasons down in the southwest. Different armors required. It's clear that's going in. So we're in a twin track. On the one hand, we're seeing the force go in, which is something that Mr. Putin will understand, we hope. But also it's right that the talking can start, and the talking may well. We've got to admit the possibility that enough guarantee, enough for Mr. Putin to say, well, I have now he wants to say I've succeeded in protecting the Russian people. I think we're quietly seeing his territorial demands go a little bit quieter. There was a great ceremony about the signing over and appointment of governors to Lugansk and Donetsk, the Zaporizhia region, and Crimea. These four governors that were paraded in the Kremlin and signed great documents. We've really gone a little bit quieter on that in terms of where the objectives of this war are. And I think you'll see Mr. Putin pulling back to the objectives are to ensure a secure Russia, to deal with the threat. He's going to want to tell the Russian people, I've come to a settlement, I've come to an end point which has removed the threat from Russia. And I think that's the path that the Chinese are most hoping they can work on and facilitate. So we'll watch these two parallel tracks over the next weeks and months.
And as well as whilst Putin has been rattling his sabre down in the southern part of his reach, what we have seen within the United Kingdom, and because we have now gone over the anniversary, a lot of programmes of refugees who have found themselves over here. And I suppose one of the heartwarming things, if you are to take a positive out of such appalling conflict, is that the world wakes up to the idea of being a human place of refuge for people. And I suppose the other thing that leads me to is to consider, is there more that we as a community, particularly with the connections that we're beginning to have with Ukraine, but there's other parts in Central Europe, Belarus being one of them, where we should perhaps be ensuring that there is more being done from our shores that would allow those people who treasure their democratic rights to have comfort that we would stand with them in some way.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, we sometimes hear from the British government down in Westminster here that they're really very cautious about establishing precedent. And it was a great success to have such a huge precedent created of the Homes for Ukrainians scheme. Admittedly, Britain has, I think currently we're accommodating something like about 150, or have at some stage taken in, some maybe have left, moved to other European countries, about 150,000 level. I'm sorry, I forget the Scottish numbers. It's pretty well proportionate, so it's about the 10 to 15,000 level, I seem to recollect. And Scotland did particularly well by having not just a scheme for Ukrainians that knew Ukrainians so they could go to their friends, and also what was called the Homes for Ukraine scheme, but Scotland, of course, added the additional dimension of humanitarian assistance by having a Scottish government scheme, which meant you didn't have to have a sponsor. It made it very easy for Ukrainians to sign up to, and good numbers did sign up to that. Unfortunately, as we know, of course, we ended up with having to rent ships in Leith and in Glasgow to put about 700 on each. But in terms of other countries, it is a great precedent to have set. And Belarusians who have opposed the Russian invasion, these wonderful, what we call the railway partisans, also the cyber partisans, there's a very substantial number now, primarily in Warsaw, in Poland, also in Poland, Lithuania. I'm sorry to say Britain's not done such a good job as they perhaps could have done for recognising, other than the standard asylum seeker scheme, which, as we know, is not easy. We're not saying that Belarusians haven't been able to gain asylum in Britain. A good number have gone through that. And in fact, maybe I should give an advert that there's going to be a marvellous event at the Scottish Storytelling Centre in Edinburgh on the Canongate on the 1st of March, 7 o'clock. There's people, refugees, people who have come from Belarus that were very strongly involved in the opposition, who are going to be presenting information on the existence of political prisoners. So there's two people actually going to be in an open public event at the Scottish Storytelling Centre, evening, 1st of March, 7 o'clock, who are examples of Britain welcoming in certain ways, also from Belarus, but not as easy as for Ukraine. And I'd add the further dimension that, just as I'm a man who grew up with the sons and daughters of the Polish people, Scotland's had a wonderful track record of welcoming people, refugees, and people from abroad of many countries. But of course, particularly, we have this wonderfully strong Polish link, which in turn has a very strong link with Ukrainians. And I don't need to waste time on Broadcasting Scotland emphasising the strong role the Polish people have had culturally, economically, educationally in Scotland. And we're now getting the same from Ukrainians. For this small investment we make, the return and the richness that it brings to our country, and Scotland's particularly benefited from this, is well worthwhile. And of course, we've got to think about the post-war stage. There will be a Belarus after Lukashenko. There will be a Ukraine after the Putin invasion, once again. And many people are now already working and looking to the post-war period. And Britain, and Scotland in particular, with the role they've played, are in prime position and will be very welcome partners in the economic development of Ukraine. And if we play the same role in other countries, like Belarus, we've also got to think about the Balkans area as well, is in need of support and assistance. And you were right earlier in the introduction to mention Moldova issues there. Then everyone will benefit. There's a win-win for us in this kind of humanitarian assistance. and it's great to see the role Scotland has played, but we do need a wake up call. The British Home Office really needs to be willing to create more precedents. And my goodness, we've let 100, welcomed 150,000 or so Ukrainians. Is it such a problem? The other few thousands. I mean, when we look at the population we are and compare what we're doing, I mean, look at Germany, nearly a million. Look at Poland, 40 million people welcomed over 2 million Ukrainians. They found the resources, the funds, and the houses to do that. That's a million, 2 million. That's over 10 times what Britain has offered. So, we're not really playing a proportional role in this yet. And that piece of sea between the channel between Europe and Britain and our visa and our control system, it really has made it difficult. We obviously have to shake up the asylum system as well. So a lot still to be done, but bravo Scotland for taking a particular lead.
Indeed, and the influence of those who have come across from Poland, from Ukraine, and so on. Of course, Catherine Tchaikovsky, a friend of mine down in Kirkmichael, writer who wrote a wonderful play, Wormwood, all about the fallout from Chernobyl, which brought to the attention of many children within Scotland because it was a higher drama text for many years. And my own daughter has had a Ukrainian ballet dancer now start working in her dance school, although she did, I believe, dance for a Moscow ballet company, so the Westminster government will no doubt run a campaign at some point with an advert suggesting she retrains at something else. But moving on from Ukraine, we come to another area of international relations, which is slightly closer to home, which of course is the Northern Ireland Protocol. As we all sit on tenterhooks hearing that Rishi Sunak is going to is not going to waste any time and is going to indeed put as much effort as he can into finding a solution. We wait to see what the Democratic Unionist parties party under Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, or indeed other parties there, whilst tensions are high, obviously due to the events surrounding the shooting of an off-duty policeman. It reminds us that this is not an easy issue to resolve, but of course we begin by considering, Alan, whether or not international law is sovereign. I know that Dara O'Brien, amongst many, would, when he was asked about the British border, said, about the Irish border, said, you're talking about the British border because the Irish border is the sea. There are many very good people out there putting their heads together in order to make some sense of this, but they don't often seem to be in the room when decisions are made.
Well, yes, my goodness, the complex problem of sovereignty and international law. And, I'm not party to all the agreements and the detail of what Britain has signed up to over the years in terms of international treaties, all the maritime law ones and all this kind of thing. The real issue often comes along and when you actually get, as we've got tied up into over the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Brexit agreement, when essentially you end up signing up to exclusive and conflicting aspects of agreement. And this one really, in the end, did not square. I mean, Boris Johnson, there'll be no borders or controls down the Irish Sea, and then somehow having to square this with the fact there'll be an open flow of goods over the border. And I mean, the Northern Ireland Protocol, it was made at a time we were in the European Union, so that worked. I mean, I'm not party to the actual ink and the small print in all these agreements and parties, and that's where the brains, as you've rightly said, really need to be in the room. And I think the important thing is that it does seem we've at least moved to a stage of reasonably goodwill round the negotiating table. If there is at least a starting point where there is a political goodwill that what we have at the moment is not working, and therefore something different that will work has to be put in place. Of course, and anybody who's and there's many things to be concerned about Brexit over would probably say, well, perhaps Scotland should get what Scotland voted for, and there certainly wouldn't be an issue and a problem with the Scotch goods leaving um, for Ireland. But you still have the problem of Northern Ireland dragged into a Brexit by Westminster and London and the English voters. So yeah, very, very difficult to square, but there does seem to be momentum. And let's hope that technocrats who can try and square up inconsistent international agreements. And we have to remember, okay, this sovereignty issue, we do sign away with agreements over jurisdiction. There are a number of areas of international jurisdiction we have signed up to and will go along with. It's obviously the sovereignty is there. Individual countries decide what they will cede, but we are currently in a situation we have got a lot of agreements where we have ceded sovereignty in respect to international agreements, and the fact there are many things that international agreements you have to work to. I mean, I'm a scientist. How do you think we get international standards? We have to give in to agree that, well, we're all going to be the same with our C connectors that go in the mobile phone. You have real problems when actually there isn't a cessation of a national right to decide. Well, of course, to Britain with its 3-pin plug is an interesting example. And when you get that, you just get complicated international life. We're all living in a very small world now, so we're having to cede sovereignty in all kinds of ways to make the complex international world work. But getting back to Northern Ireland Protocol, I'm getting to the age I've just seen so many conflicting policies ending up being agreed, put into legislation that then just don't often square off. It's just such a complicated world we live in, and it's clear Northern Ireland Protocol and Brexit agreement was one such example.
I think one of the things that for quite a few political commentators, there's this intransigence that seems to be inbuilt within the Democratic Unionist Party, which seems to mirror the intransigence of certain populist leaders right throughout the whole of Europe. And that there is a kind of kickback against that in some parts of the world, but not necessarily in every part of the world. You see in Europe, Italy, Hungary, Sweden, heaven forfend, Holland as well, where the rise in Marine Le Pen in France, you're seeing a kind of intransigent approach that they believe will benefit the group that they represent. I use the word represent cautiously. I think sometimes they lead rather than represent people. And I think here, the European Reform Group in Westminster, alongside the Democratic Unionist Party, would appear to have been emboldened over the last few years because there has been complete incompetence at the heart of how to, you referred to Boris Johnson saying there's going to be none of this, and then waking up one morning and going, oh, well, there's going to be some of that, almost like a Chick Murray approach to politics. So yes. It's a bit of a worry. One would hope that hard heads get knocked together and indeed soft thinking appears.
Well, absolutely. And as I said earlier, this is where this all parties round the table, there's got to be a goodwill and a pragmatism. We're not going to get a solution. And of course, in democracies, the European model of often a fragmentation in parliaments and complex coalitions, that all too often is giving power and leverage to minority views that will seek to exploit that situation. Unfortunately, of course, we saw that with what happened with Theresa May in that dreadful 2016, the failed election, where she thought she'd increase her majority, did absolutely the opposite, and then put herself in hock to Northern Ireland politics and all that's ensued for that. Of course, at least Boris Johnson put himself up to the polls. He's now got a huge majority, essentially, to get votes through in Parliament. But Of course, we've got the Northern Ireland Assembly issue, and the people of Northern Ireland deserve a functioning, operating government, and it is difficult really to see from outside that this really is serving the people of Northern Ireland as well as it could. And in that respect, I really am rather concerned for the state of democracy and the public voice in Northern Ireland. They clearly want a solution, but continuing this suspension of the Northern Ireland Assembly is really clearly problematic for the Northern Ireland people. And I would have thought the parties involved there really should realise that that side has gone on rather too long. So there's all these other factors that are going with the fact that as long as there's not an agreement, we've essentially got paralysis in Northern Ireland over a whole range of local government matters. One can only but hope that time, and sooner rather than later, will resolve this and get appropriate governance back into Northern Ireland. The linkage, the game that's been played there, it's difficult to see why the Northern Ireland people are not expressing a dissatisfaction for this. Very difficult to understand the extent to which democracy really is working in Northern Ireland at present, when you've got that kind of a leadership holding the people to ransom, essentially.
Indeed, and of course, one of the issues keeping with Brexit is that in my adult lifetime, I don't think I've ever seen, I said this, I think, on Tuesday night, gaps in the supply chain of food leading to shelves being empty in supermarkets, to the point now that we have de facto gone into rationing, as the likes of Tesco and Asda, I think in Sainsbury's as well. My apologies if I'm miscalling them, but they seem to be sitting with a lack of produce on shelves. And as I was reading, Alan, over the weekend, there are tomato suppliers in the UK who cannot provide us with any more because they cannot afford to grow them. There are turnip suppliers who won't put them out because they don't have people to pick them. There seems to be a problem in weather down in the south or there in Spain and so on. However, there only seems to be one market in the whole of Europe that it is affecting. Would it possible, I know this is a radical thought and I don't want to push you into a place that seems absurd, but do you think it might have something to do with that bee thing that's happening?
The bee thing. Oh, well, you're actually talking to, this is an area I do have considerable expertise in, because I have a mobility handicapped disabled wife. So I am the person who does the household shopping in South Edinburgh. And I won't give any adverts, but my range of local supermarkets that I go to, I did wake it up about a week or two ago to thinking, my goodness, these baskets in the vegetable area, they really are looking empty. So it's not I think anybody who's gone shopping in the last 2 weeks knows we have a big problem. It's curious, it's just coming around about that period, because my tomato shop about 3 weeks ago was perfectly okay, but not now. So where are we with this? Well, I mean, like you, I can only go by what we see on social media, and we see social media from France and Germany sharing images of very well-stocked supermarkets. Okay, so I'll believe that. I don't think people are deliberately photoshopping empty shelves in France and Germany. I think we will take that. There's enough on social media to make it clear that supplies within the European Union are actually working well. And we also have to remember there is a fair bit of elasticity in all these vegetable production, the fruit production markets. I've been taking a look at the weekend media and press on this, so I take my information. This is a bit like what the papers say, comment from Dr. Flowers. But they're reporting the position of particularly the Spanish farmers, who are really saying that in the normal circumstances can sustain. Yes, they have had my favorite aubergine is apparently down 25% in Spain in terms of the crop at the moment. Others about down 20%. But they're saying the market can actually sustain that kind of dip over short periods, like a number of weeks like we have now. And clearly it has in Europe. So what we're hearing, and I think anybody who reads the papers can see what the statements are, that, okay, when there is this dip, the difficulty of the bureaucracy and the administration of exports from Europe, and we're also, by the way, let's include the North African countries. Morocco's quite important in this. Egypt, Tunisia, they're outside the EU. I mean, this is a getting things into Britain problem, and of course, particularly from the EU, the bureaucracy, the lorry queues. I mean, I'm not surprised there's a shortage of lorry driver. What lorry driver, when they can earn a good living, going between Spain, France, Germany, Poland, back to Spain again, around Europe, is going to sit in queues in Calais because it takes so long and there's issues handling the paperwork and the staffing, and we just don't seem to have put in place the infrastructure. Again, this is this other conflict. We go and legislate. We do this exit from the European Union, which needs new, different controls. And that's clearly not been managed well. And we now wonder, okay, why is there a shortage of drivers prepared to drive lorries into Britain? Well, I wouldn't, that's not my way of wanting to spend my time, not getting back to the wife for the weekend because I'm stuck in a queue in Calais trying to get across to Britain with the vegetables. So these are real issues that have to be resolved. And this dip, and Britain, clearly some providers have actually said, well, with the new Brexit bureaucracy and administration and transport issues, Britain's going to be the bottom of their supply queue. If you're going to be shifting and you're saying that you can't supply, you can't meet the contracts, you're going to supply France and Germany first. They're easy. Nothing's changed there. So none of this is absolutely any surprise. It's all incredibly logical. Yeah, and the thing is, you've got to have the whole story, and this discussion allows us to share. It's quite clear. A lot of good press and newspapers in Britain over this weekend have given the total story. Well, yes, it is to do with the weather, and there's been climatic issues with the harvest, but the issue is that the system we have for getting goods into Britain, that could not manage that as well as a system of free flow in Europe. So you've got to add on, the issue is, well, it's not 100%, it's a combination. There's a horrendous synergy. Brexit plus climate change, it's emptied our supermarket shelves. That's the end of things. So yes, we've got to admit the B word is in there, and it's a wake-up call to sort out the issues that are putting Britain at the bottom of the supply chain when an issue like this comes. So good grief, whichever ministries, and I notice the Spanish people are saying you've got to deal with so many government departments, and not just agriculture and all that. You've got to deal with the customs and excise and home office issues as well on border controls. My goodness, big wake-up call. A lot more work to be done if the British government wants to make Brexit work. It's not working now.
Indeed, and Jings Crivens, help me, Bob, if I can use a Sunday Post expression on this very day. You would think that given the idea that the economies of Southern Europe would look to reduce the amount of cost in terms of supplying goods, would appear to be something that those with a little bit of money in their bank account, indeed business nous, might be able to understand. But the UK government seems to be lacking a few of those knowledgeable business heads, especially as it would appear that the reports again this week just exactly how in households up and down the country in Scotland, the cost of living crisis is really beginning to bite. And it has been reported this week, Alan, I know that you do the shopping, I do the shopping too, but What is happening just now is that many families are not just cutting down on essentials, but we're beginning to see, apparently, a cutting down on a Sunday roast, that people are not indulging themselves in something that was a staple of a family meal, a family get together. And for many families, working class, middle class, no matter what class, that was an opportunity to make those connections on a weekly basis. And one can only wonder what that will lead to, as societal breakdown is always a thing that people on the right would point at as being the consequence of a variety of factors, never their fault. But here, there is clearly a connection, surely.
Well, absolutely. I mean, healthy eating, happy eating. I learned through Ukraine students I was helping to bring into Britain. We had the lockdown, COVID, and people had to go into a 10-day quarantine. Well, I wasn't only shopping for my own household. Through students I had, part of the time in London, I was rushing around supermarkets with umpteen trolleys, trying to deal with, I had up to 20 Ukrainian students at a time. Now, what am I leading to? They really knew how to eat low cost. In fact, they were the ones who taught me about packets of drumsticks, chicken drumsticks, and good ways to get at, healthy eating, some meats. So, if it was a chicken roast for the Sunday dinner, that used to be not too expensive. I mean, I know the figures for it. Usually a kilogram of drumsticks in some supermarket about £1.60. So about £2.80. I was seeing over 50% increases in these. Now, when all the pounds add together on a budget, when you're fiddling around trying to get a family on minimum wage levels subsistence, yes. And how does this equilibrate these costs? It's a horrendous thing for the economy to be having to square. And by the way, one other point, you did raise this question about the local suppliers. We've got a lot of chicken. My goodness, Scotland, the best beef in the world. But unfortunately, there's a demand and supply thing, and there are price pressures we're seeing. The meats. I'm looking at these roasts, and it's scary, these figures that. And I have to say, there you are. I mean, I would sort of count myself as a sort of, at least middle income. I got a few spare pennies in my pocket, but I'm choosing to buy more chicken than I'm having Angus beef these days. That's for sure. So yeah, the Sunday roast is absolutely a threat. But there is an issue with the supermarkets, and maybe they're going to have to ease off. I mean, I know we're seeing, we go into certain supermarkets, got the price promise, and everyone's matching everybody else's price to try to go with a flagship that's a low cost supermarket name. And yeah, I mean, a bit of a relaxation. I mean, the suppliers have to make their crust. Um, and then this is where there is a bit of a disgrace for Scotland on the energy supply side of things, because some of these costs actually are the energy related ones. They're going into the food supply chain. Their costs. My goodness, Scotland, with all its renewable energy, a couple of nuclear power stations whose costs have not gone up, and we're pegged to the gas price, for God's sake. I mean, it all knocks on, and what do you end up with? Exactly. Serious worry that we're not managing, potentially not going to manage the nutrition. And, I'm looking at these food bags. You walk outside the supermarket, and thank goodness there's enough people like myself who can toss a few things into that. And I'm pleased to see that the Scottish people are trying to help each other. And let's hope the people who aren't needy, and we do know that the nature of people is right, numbers of people are rising. The demand on food banks is becoming, really, really quite extreme. But at least we have these systems, and we're certainly, if the government can't act, at least it's good to see that the people and the Scottish people are very good in this respect. I've seen these boxes in the supermarkets; they're looking fuller than they ever have before, because, well, programs like what you're doing now is raising the awareness that there is a big issue here, and we have to, at least initially in a community spirit, help out. But something has to be done to assist, particularly our indigenous food suppliers. And one of the first starting points would be to sort out this ridiculous way Scotland's energy prices are dominated by what is essentially a south of a border problem.
Indeed. And of course, we go from Sunday roast to the theory that somebody's being roasted for what they do on a Sunday. And it is, of course, reference to the current leadership election within the Scottish National Party, as theocracy has been raised as an issue within the context of the election, with the established church or secular state. Which is it likely to be? The leadership race are reminding us why the only way to guarantee for rights for all minorities, according to many, whether it be ethnic, whether it be religious or LGBTQ+, is through that separation between church and state. Now, we are probably in the 21st century likely to think of theocracy being something that is a Middle Eastern problem or an issue in Afghanistan or whatever. I was in the Hebrides in October 2021 on a Sunday. I'm still having therapy. The idea that somehow the imposition of your belief system is something that is akin to respect of that belief system is up front and centre here. And I think that it's one of those things that whilst, whether it be Ash, Kate or Humza, we're going to end up with this being perhaps even a hangover once this is all done.
Well, you were in the Hebrides. I have fortunate enough to have some very nice little holiday lets. My wife holidayed up in Shegra near Kinlochbervie, right up there in the northwest. So we're very aware, and I'm very aware. I'm Scottish Presbyterian. I went as a young lad and was baptised in a church in Edinburgh, into the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Not non-practicing, I will admit to, but I'm on the credo roll of a lovely church in South Edinburgh. And my wife who holidayed there, I mean, they were living in the 50s with quite a substantial Free Church of Scotland, called the Free. And yes, the unwillingness, the version of respect for the Sabbath meant a lot of things don't happen and didn't happen on that day. There are also a lot of other views that are at variance with the majority of the people of Scotland. So this is a group with a minority view. Now, in Kinlochbervie, there's only really a couple of shops, and one is run by a member of the Free Church of Scotland, and we all respect him, and he's a very worthy member of the community, and he chooses not to do business on a Sunday. But there's another shop as part of a well-known Scottish chain that does open and provide the neighbourhood. So each until they're kind and they coexist and respect each other. So I think if we get that approach, your experience in the Hebrides must have come out of what seemed to be a monopoly of Free Church of Scotland ownerships of all the local shops by the side. There's absolutely nothing was happening. And maybe that's the case. So that's maybe what the majority view is in that particular area. And in which case we show tolerance and somehow have to live for it and plan for the fact that we better make sure we've got a full petrol tank and a full larder on the Saturday if you're anywhere in the Hebrides. But there is the broader and more serious issue of, we're wanting to sustain a democracy. And I believe that the inherent democratic virtues and ethos of the Scottish people are not going to give way to to a theocracy. I always remember years ago, and in fact it's about time, maybe the play The Three Estates was shown again, and a strict division between the Parliament, the political, and the religious, and the state royalty. We need to keep that absolute separation, and then individual churches. We have a General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. I trust them to manage their affairs, which relates to a much larger population of religious believers than the Free Church of Scotland has, which I gather is represents somewhere less than 10% of the population. So um, tails wagging dogs comes to mind. I don't think the Scottish people will really put up with too much of that, but we of course do show religious tolerance and everyone unto their own.
Indeed, yon Sir David Lindsay Kent a thing or two, and indeed it possibly is time for us to investigate just exactly how powerful the kirk ought to be. I, like yourself, Presbyterian, I was brought up in the Ayr United Free Church of Scotland, if you can imagine such a thing, and I think we thought that the likes of Katie Forbes was a wee bit lefty. So it's an interesting debate in one hand, but also for some quite a terrifying prospect. Well, Alan, my grateful thanks to you for being with us. We have come to the end of our time on air. So thank you very much for all of your observations and indeed your chat this afternoon, which has been fantastic and great to have.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity for this discussion on a very important weekend for Ukraine and for highlighting so many of the important issues affecting the people of Scotland. It's been a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you.
Fantastic. And whilst that is indeed it for this week's Full Scottage, it's been a day where we've heard all about little green men in Crimea, phone connectors under the sea that actually connect because of international cooperation. Wonder who is the real Chick Murray of Scottish politics, perhaps? I might return to that at some point. And empty-headed baskets in a vegetable area in our supermarkets, which is just part of what we do here at Broadcasting Scotland, which is indeed bring a Scottish perspective to the headlines that you're used to seeing during the course of your week. But before I do go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of all of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular payment on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much. Now, for those who are regular watchers, you will know that Linda, who has been at the helm of Broadcasting Scotland since its inception, has had a bit of a tumble out in the water, and she is indeed just not a million miles from where I'm sitting just now, back at the helm, helping out. But what it did do was signify to all of us here at Broadcasting Scotland just exactly how fragile not only your shoulder can be when you fall out a boat, but also how fragile our volunteering can be in terms of ensuring that you have a service from us here. So please do make sure that if you want us to continue and indeed employ staff here to make better and bigger and more programmes, please help us by contributing. And if you're on social media, please get the message out. When we have guests the calibre of Alan with us today, it is important that we see those types of messages going out there to ensure that there is a very strong Scottish perspective in the media. Now, our programmes will always be free to view, so therefore just £5 a month. If you can afford it, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and ensure that the programmes like today are continuing to be made. So from myself and my fellow 21st century man, we both do the shopping, so we can claim that. It's goodbye for now, and thank you for watching.